Russia has launched 833 attacks on the Zaporizhia region and at least 19 more on Donetsk, killing at least 3 Ukrainians and wounding more than 10 in a single reporting cycle. And while bombs fall, Washington is having what can only be described as a very public internal breakdown over Ukraine policy, with U.S. Ambassador Julie Davis announcing she'll retire in June over a direct dispute with the Trump administration's direction. This isn't a footnote. This is a seismic crack in the Western alliance's posture at the worst possible moment. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is Ambassador Davis's departure a principled stand, or is it a sign that the adults are losing patience with a foreign policy establishment that got Ukraine catastrophically wrong from the beginning?
Thanks, Emma. Look, I'll say it plainly. This departure matters enormously, and not for the reasons the legacy media will tell you. The framing you'll hear from CNN and the BBC is that a heroic diplomat is walking away in protest against Trump's heartless abandonment of democratic Ukraine. And that framing is completely dishonest. What we actually have is a senior State Department official who was embedded in a policy framework, the Blinken, Nuland, open-ended commitment framework that has produced 3 years of industrial-scale slaughter with no defined end state, no victory conditions, and no territorial recovery worth speaking of. Russia controls more Ukrainian land today than it did in late 2022. Douglas Murray has been right about this for years. Good intentions dressed up as strategy are not strategy. And what concerns me deeply is that Davis's exit may trigger a broader exodus of institutional Ukraine hands from state at precisely the moment when coherent diplomatic engagement matters most. That institutional knowledge walking out the door could be more dangerous than any single policy dispute.
But Sophia, devil's advocate here, isn't there a legitimate argument that the Trump administration is creating the very vacuum you're worried about? That by signaling ambivalence toward Ukraine, Washington is actually handing Putin exactly what he wants. And James, what's your take on this?
Well, look, here's what I think Sophia is missing in an otherwise solid analysis. The institutional framework that Davis represented isn't something to mourn uncritically. We are talking about the same State Department apparatus that, for 3 years, treated Ukraine as an ideological project rather than a strategic calculation. The numbers here are brutal, and they matter. Over $175 billion in combined Western support, and Russia still holds the territory it seized. The front lines are static. Ukrainian manpower is depleted. You cannot separate Davis's departure from the policy legacy she was defending, and that policy legacy has an abysmal track record by any measurable outcome. Trump's instinct toward a negotiated settlement may be uncomfortable for the foreign policy establishment, but the establishment doesn't have a winning strategy to offer as an alternative. Show me the plan. Show me the benchmark. There isn't one.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely. Yes, the previous strategy failed, I've said that. But the answer to a failed strategy is a better strategy, not a policy vacuum. And right now we don't have a Trump-Ukraine doctrine. We have uncertainty. Russia is launching 33 attacks on Zaporizhia in a single period. 833. That is not a regime preparing to negotiate in good faith. That is a regime testing whether Western resolve has cracked. And if the signal coming out of Washington is that America's diplomatic architecture is in internal chaos, Putin doesn't read that as an invitation to the peace table. He reads it as an invitation to press harder. That's the danger, not Trump's instincts, the absence of any coherent signal replacing the old framework.
Here's what I want to know, and I want both of you to be honest about this. Where does this actually go in the next 6 months? Because we've got a war grinding on, a diplomatic rupture in Washington, and European publics that polling data tells us are quietly losing the stomach for this. James, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, and I want to be careful here because nothing about this is predetermined, the next 90 days of American positioning are going to be decisive. If the Trump administration can convert its transactional instincts into actual leverage architecture, coherent sanctions pressure, energy policy coordination with Europe, selective military commitments tied to benchmarks, there's a narrow path to forcing a negotiated framework that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty over pre-2022 lines. It's narrow, but it exists. What I'm watching is whether the administration fills the diplomatic vacuum Davis is leaving with something purposeful, or whether the departure just accelerates drift.
Here's what concerns me most, and this is the scenario I think markets and security analysts are genuinely underweighting. The risk isn't a dramatic American abandonment of Ukraine. It's something quieter and more corrosive. It's that the internal State Department dispute, the departures, the policy uncertainty, produces 6 months of ambiguous signals that Russia interprets as an open window. What history tells us, and 1938 is uncomfortable, but it's there, is that dictators don't respond to ambiguity with caution. They respond with acceleration. 833 attacks on Zaporizhia isn't Russia preparing a peace offer. If this trajectory continues without a clear Western countersignal, the risk is Ukraine faces the negotiating table from a position of military exhaustion rather than any kind of strength.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, a genuinely important conversation, and one that isn't finished by a long stretch. One thing's certain tonight. Somewhere in the Kremlin, they're watching Ambassador Davis pack her boxes with considerable satisfaction.